My 8-year-old granddaughter rolled her eyes and said, "You can't sit with us. Mom said you're an old burden." The whole table burst out laughing, including my own son. I stood up and left quietly. That night, he texted, "Payment still due tomorrow?" I replied, "Figure it out." The next day, panic. It was exactly 7:14 p.m. on a Tuesday when the veneer of my family life finally cracked, revealing the rot underneath, and it happened at table 12 of the Gilded Olive, an establishment where the risotto costs $45 and the silence between courses costs significantly more. I had arrived 10 minutes early, as is my custom, dressed in the charcoal suit I usually reserve for board meetings or funerals, feeling a foolish sort of optimism that perhaps this dinner would be different, that perhaps my son, David, and his wife, Elena, had invited me out of genuine affection, rather than the transactional obligation that had defined our relationship for the last decade. I sat there, sipping a sparkling water with a twist of lemon, watching the door, and checking my watch, a vintage Omega that had belonged to my father, noting that they were late again. When they finally breezed in at 7:23 p.m., there was no apology, just a flurry of noise and shifting chairs. David looked tired, his eyes darting to his phone every few seconds, checking emails for the tech consultancy I had helped him seed with a $150,000 strictly business loan 5 years ago, a loan that had somehow morphed into a gift in his mind. Elena looked impeccable, wearing a designer dress that I knew cost more than my first car, her smile tight and practiced as she waved at an acquaintance across the room before barely acknowledging me. And then there was Sophie, my 8-year-old granddaughter, a child I had loved with a fierce, aching devotion since the moment I held her in the hospital delivery room while David was out getting coffee. She sat across from me, her attention entirely consumed by a tablet screen, the blue light reflecting in her eyes. I tried to engage them. I asked David about the Q3 projections. He gave a vague, dismissive answer about market volatility. I asked Elena about her upcoming charity gala. She complained about the caterer. Then, seeking a connection, I turned to Sophie. I leaned forward, putting on my best grandfatherly smile, the one that used to make her giggle when she was a toddler, and asked if she wanted to sit next to me so we could look at the dessert menu together, specifically to see if they had the chocolate lava cake she used to love. The table went quiet. Sophie didn't look up immediately. She finished whatever game level she was playing, sighed with an exaggerated theatricality that mirrored her mother's mannerisms perfectly, and then looked me dead in the eye. She rolled her eyes, a slow, deliberate arc of disdain, and said, loud enough for the waiter pouring wine at the next table to freeze, "You can't sit with us. Mom said you're an old burden." The air left the immediate vicinity of the table. I felt a cold, sharp numbness spread from my chest to my fingertips. I looked at David, expecting horror, expecting a reprimand, expecting him to be the father I raised him to be. Instead, he chuckled. It wasn't a nervous laugh. It was a genuine, amused snort. He looked at Elena and said, "She really has no filter, does she? Kids say the darndest things." Elena covered her mouth, but her eyes were crinkled in mirth. "Oh, stop it, Sophie," she said, her voice lacking any real authority or correction. "Grandpa isn't a burden, he's useful." They both burst out laughing then, a shared, intimate joke that I was the punchline of. The waiter, a young man with a name tag that read Julian, looked at me with profound pity, his hand hovering over the wine bottle. That look of pity from a stranger was the catalyst. It was the moment the fog of parental denial lifted. I looked at my son, 34 years old, driving a Range Rover I made the lease payments on, living in a 4-bedroom colonial in a zip code he couldn't afford without my monthly stipend, and I saw a stranger. I saw a man who didn't respect me, raising a daughter to despise me, married to a woman who viewed me as a line item in her budget. The laughter was still bubbling around the table when I stood up. I didn't slam the table. I didn't shout. I simply placed my napkin over my untouched appetizer plate. The movement caught David's eye. "Dad, where are you going? We haven't ordered mains yet," he said, his tone shifting from amusement to mild annoyance. "I'm afraid I've lost my appetite," I said, my voice steady, surprisingly calm even to my own ears. "And it seems I am intruding on your family dinner." Elena stopped laughing. "Don't be dramatic, Arthur. She's 8. Sit down. We need to talk about the tuition for next semester anyway." That word tuition, it hung in the air like a smog. $28,000 a year for Sophie's private academy. I looked at Elena, really looked at her, and saw the calculation behind the beauty. "No," I said. "I don't think we do." I signaled Julian. "I'll take the check for the sparkling water at the bar. The rest of the table is separate." I walked away. I didn't look back, though I heard David calling, Dad, come on, don't be like that." I walked out of the Gilded Olive, the cool October air hitting my face, and got into my sedan. I drove in silence for 40 minutes, the radio off, my mind replaying the scene on a loop. Mom said, "You're an old burden." It wasn't an 8-year-old's thought. It was a parrot repeating what she heard at the dinner table at home. It was the doctrine of their household. I arrived at my home, a quiet house that had felt too large since my wife, Margaret, passed away 6 years ago. I walked into my study and sat in the leather wingback chair where I had signed the papers for David's college fund, for his first mortgage, for the trust I had set up for Sophie. I sat there in the dark for 3 hours, just thinking. I thought about the trajectory that brought us here. It wasn't sudden. It was a slow erosion. I remembered when David was 22, graduating with a degree in philosophy that I knew wouldn't pay the bills, but I supported him because I wanted him to find himself. Then the gap years in Europe, funded by by my bonuses. Then the startup phase, the constant requests for bridge capital that never seemed to bridge anything but his lifestyle expenses. I thought about the monthly transfer of $4,500 that I set up 3 years ago, when Elena claimed she wanted to go back to school but needed help with household management, a schooling she never started, while the money continued to flow. I was their safety net, their bank, their retirement plan, and apparently, their burden. I pulled out a legal pad and a pen. I didn't use a computer. I needed the physical friction of ink on paper. I began to list it all. Item 1. The mortgage on 42 Oak Creek Drive. The deed was in their name, but I had provided the down payment of $120,000, and for the last 18 months, I had been covering the difference between what David said he could pay and what the bank demanded, another $1,200 a month. Item 2. The cars. 2 luxury leases. I was the guarantor. Item 3. The credit card debt I had cleared for them last Christmas. $16,412 under the promise that they would cut up the cards. I knew for a fact they hadn't. Item 4. Sophie's tuition. Item 5. The emergency requests. The new HVAC unit. The vacation to Cabo that was necessary for David's mental health. The total was staggering. I ran the numbers in my head. In the last calendar year alone, I had transferred $95,000 to them. $95,000 to be called a burden by a child echoing her mother. My phone buzzed on the desk at 11:42 p.m. It was David. The message read, "Payment's still due tomorrow. Rent is coming up and we're a little short this month BC of the car repairs. Also, you really embarrassed us tonight. Elena is crying." I stared at the screen. The audacity was breathtaking. Not an apology, not a question about my feelings. Just a demand for money and a guilt trip about his wife's performative tears. Payment still due tomorrow? As if I were a tenant late on rent. As if he were the landlord of my affection. I typed my response slowly, my fingers trembling slightly, not from age, but from a cold, hard rage that was crystallizing into resolve. I typed, "Figure it out." I hit send. Then I turned the phone off. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the chair, watching the moonlight move across the floorboards, formulating the next steps. I knew exactly what would happen when the sun rose. Panic, denial, anger, bargaining, the stages of grief, but for a lost income stream. I needed to be ready. I needed to be bulletproof. At 8 a.m. the next morning, I drove to the office of Harrison and Associates. Tom Harrison has been my lawyer and friend for 30 years. He's a man who wears suspenders not as a fashion statement, but as a structural necessity. A man who knows where all the bodies are buried because he brought the shovels. I didn't have an appointment, but his secretary, Martha, ushered me right in. "Arthur," Tom said, looking up from a stack of files, his bushy eyebrows knitting together. "You look like you're ready to go to war. Coffee?" "Black," I said, sitting down. "And yes, I need to restructure my estate. Immediately. And I need to draft a formal demand letter for the repayment of a loan." Tom leaned back, steepling his fingers. "David?" he asked. He knew. He had warned me years ago that I was enabling him. "David," I confirmed. "I want to sever all recurring transfers. I want to remove him as power of attorney. I want to rewrite the will to place Sophie's inheritance in a trust, accessible only when she turns 35, contingent on drug testing and gainful employment, with you as the executor, not David, and the business loan, the one from 2020. Do we still have the promissory note?" Tom nodded slowly, a grim look of satisfaction on his face. "We do. It was never formally discharged. It's a demand note, Arthur, callable at any time." "Call it," I said. "Full amount, plus interest." Tom whistled low. "That's the nuclear option, Art. You know that will ruin him financially? He doesn't have the liquidity to pay back $150,000. "I know," I said, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of clarity. He's a smart boy. He has a degree in philosophy. He can figure it out. I spent the next 4 hours in Tom's office, signing documents, reviewing ledgers, and dismantling the financial scaffold I had built around my son's life. We itemized every gift, every loan, distinguishing legally between what was recoverable and what was gone. The mortgage assistance? Gone. The tuition? I would pay the school directly for the remainder of the semester because I would not punish Sophie for her parents' sins. But after that, they were on their own. The car leases? I was the guarantor, which meant if they defaulted, I was on the hook. "Cancel the leases," I told Tom. "Pay the early termination fees. Take the cars back. They'll be stranded," Tom noted, scribbling on a yellow pad. "They have Uber," I replied. By the time I turned my phone back on at 12:30 p.m., I had 47 missed calls and 62 text messages. The progression of the texts was fascinating. A psychological case study in real time. 8:15 a.m. From David. "Dad, joke's over. Where's the transfer? The mortgage auto draft hits at noon." 8:45 a.m. From Elena. "Arthur, I hope you're okay. David is worried. Please call us." 9:30 a.m. From David. "Are you serious right now? You can't just cut us off without warning. That's illegal." It wasn't. 10:15 a.m. From David. "I'm at the bank. They said the standing order was canceled. Call me now." 11 a.m. From Elena. "This is abusive. You are hurting your grandchild. How do you expect us to feed her?" 11:45 a.m. From David. "I'm coming over." I read them all with a clinical detachment. The mention of feeding Sophie was particularly rich, considering they dined at the Gilded Olive 3 times a week. I put the phone in my pocket and drove home. When I pulled into my driveway, David's Range Rover was already there, parked haphazardly on the grass, a physical manifestation of his panic. He was pacing on the front porch, phone to his ear, looking sweaty and disheveled. disheveled. When he saw my car, he practically ran down the steps. I stepped out, locking the door behind me. "Dad," he screamed, his voice cracking. "What the hell is going on? The bank returned the mortgage payment. Insufficient funds. Do you have any idea what that does to my credit score?" He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't ask why I had left the dinner. He asked about his credit score. I walked past him, up the steps to the front door. "Hello, David," I said calmly. "I imagine it lowers it quite a bit." He grabbed my arm. It was a reflex, but I stopped and looked at his hand until he let go. "Don't touch me," I said. The tone was new. It was the voice I used in the boardroom when a hostile takeover was imminent. It was the voice of the man who built a logistics empire from 2 trucks and a pager. David stepped back, looking unsettled. "Dad, look, I'm sorry about last night, okay? Sophie is a kid. She didn't mean it. Elena was just stressed. But you can't just stop the money. We have bills. We have commitments." I unlocked the front door and turned to face him. "You have bills," I corrected. "You have commitments. I have been a burden to you, David." "Elena said so." Sophie repeated it. "And as a burden, I felt it was my duty to remove myself from your life. That includes my financial presence." His face went pale. "You're punishing us because of a joke?" "It wasn't a joke," I said. "It was the truth. You don't respect me. You tolerate me because I pay for your life. Well, the transaction is over. I'm closed for business." "You can't do this," he sputtered, panic rising in his eyes. We can't make the house payment without you. We can't pay the club dues. What about Sophie's school?" "I've paid Sophie's tuition through December," I said. "You have 3 months to find a cheaper school or get a second job. As for the house, I suggest you sell it. You have some equity, mostly thanks to my down payment. If you list it now, you might get out before the bank forecloses." David looked at me as if I were speaking a foreign language. The concept of selling the house, of downsizing, of living within his actual means was alien to him. "I'm not selling the house," he spat. "This is insane. You're senile. That's what this is. I'll call the doctor. I'll get power of attorney." I laughed then. It was a dry, rasping sound. "You can try," I said, "but I just spent the morning with Tom Harrison. My medical records are up to date, and my mental capacity is certified. Oh, and speaking of Tom, you'll be receiving a registered letter tomorrow regarding the $150,000 loan for your consultancy. We're calling it in." David froze. The color drained completely from his face. You said that was an investment. You said you believed in me." "I did believe in you," I said softly. "I believed you would become a man. I was wrong. It's a demand note, David. You have 30 days. I went inside and closed the door in his face. I locked the deadbolt. I watched through the peephole as he stood there for a full minute, mouth agape, before kicking a flower pot off the porch and storming back to his car. I went to the kitchen and made a pot of tea. My hands were steady. The silence in the house was different now. It wasn't the silence of loneliness. It was the silence of a fortress after the drawbridge has been raised. But I knew this was just the opening skirmish. David was weak, but Elena was vicious. She wouldn't take this lying down. She would weaponize the only thing she had left, Sophie, and she would try to destroy my reputation. I needed to prepare for the social fallout. I sat down at the kitchen table and opened my laptop. I logged into my bank account and verified that all the transfers were canceled. Then I opened a new document. I began to write a timeline of events, a detailed log of every interaction, every loan, every insult. If they wanted to paint me as a senile, cruel old man, I would have the receipts. The discovery phase of my life had just begun. I spent the afternoon gathering physical evidence. I went to the basement and found the old boxes of financial records. I found the check stubs from 2018, 2019, 2020. I found the email chains where Elena begged for money for medical expenses that turned out to be a cosmetic surgery procedure. I had found the receipt in her car once when I borrowed it, a receipt for a mommy makeover dated the same week. I transferred $12,000 for emergency dental work. I scanned it all. I created a digital fortress to match my physical one. Around 5 p.m., the flying monkeys arrived. Not literally, of course, but the enablers. My sister Ruth called. "Arthur, David just called me in tears. He says you've lost your mind. He says you threw him off the porch. What is going on?" "David is a liar, Ruth," I said, putting her on speaker while I continued to scan documents. "And he is a 34-year-old man who needs to pay his own mortgage." "But he's your son," Ruth cried. "You can't just cut him off. He has a family. He has a family that calls me a burden," I said. "I'm simply relieving them of the weight." I hung up. I didn't have the energy to explain the nuance of 8 years of financial parasitism to Ruth, who still sent David $20 checks for his birthday. The battle lines were being drawn. They would use the family against me. They would use the community. They would use social media. I checked Elena's Instagram. She had posted a story an hour ago. A black screen with white text. "Heartbroken. Betrayal comes from those you trust the most. Please pray for our family." I almost admired the speed of her spin. She was setting the narrative. She was the victim. I was the villain. I took a screenshot. Evidence item #42. I saved it to the folder. I was no longer a grandfather or a father in this moment. I was a plaintiff preparing for the trial of his life. The sun went down, casting long shadows across the kitchen. I ate a simple dinner of toast and eggs, realizing it was the best meal I had tasted in months because it wasn't seasoned with condescension. I was alone, but I wasn't lonely. I was free. But as I washed the plate, a sudden, sharp pang of grief hit me. I thought of Sophie. I thought of her little hand in mine when we went to the zoo 3 years ago. I thought of how her eyes lit up when I bought her ice cream. That child was gone, replaced by a miniature version of her mother. But but the memory still hurt. They had taken that from me too. They had corrupted the one pure thing in my life, and for that, I would not just cut them off. I would ensure they understood the full, crushing weight of reality. I went back to my study. The aftermath was coming, but first, I had to survive the escalation. I looked at the calendar. Next week was the family reunion. Everyone would be there. Cousins, aunts, uncles, business partners. David and Elena would be there. They would try to corner me. They would try to shame me publicly. I smiled, a cold, humorless tightening of the lips. Let them try. I would bring my folder. I would bring my receipts. If they wanted a scene, I would give them a performance they would never forget. I picked up the phone and dialed Tom's number again. It was late, but he would answer. "Tom," I said when he picked up, "I need you to hire a private investigator." "For what?" Tom asked, his voice groggy. "David and Elena," I said. "I want to know where the money really went. All of it. I want bank statements, credit card trails, everything. If we are going to court or even just the court of public opinion, I want to know exactly what my burden money purchased. That's going to be expensive," Tom warned. "I have money," I said. "I just stopped supporting a family of 3. I have plenty of money." The report from investigating private detective Marcus Reynolds arrived on my desk exactly 72 hours after I commissioned it, a thick manila envelope that weighed heavily in my hand, physically representing the density of the deception my son and his wife had constructed. Reynolds, a man who spent 20 years in forensic accounting before moving to private practice, sat opposite me in my study, his face impassive as I broke the seal. "It's worse than you thought, Arthur," he said, his voice gravelly and devoid of pity. "It's not just mismanagement, it's fraud." I pulled out the dossier, a spiral-bound collection of spreadsheets, photos, and bank records that painted a portrait of absolute moral bankruptcy. I began to read, my eyes scanning the rows of data with the same cold precision I used to analyze shipping manifests. The consultancy firm, DW Solutions LLC, for which I had loaned David $150,000, had exactly 0 clients, not one. The office space he claimed to be renting in the tech district was a virtual mailbox service costing $49 a month. The rest of the rent money, $3,200 a month, was being funneled directly into a separate account held solely in Elena's name, labeled renovations, which was then used to pay off a revolving door of high-interest credit cards used for luxury goods. I turned the page to Item 7, Corporate Expenses. There it was. The server maintenance fees of $8,000, a charge at the Venetian Resort in Las Vegas, the software licensing for $10,000, a wire transfer to a luxury watch dealer in Miami for a vintage Rolex Submariner. I looked up at Reynolds. "He bought a watch," I said, my voice flat. "He bought a watch with my money while asking me to pay his mortgage." Reynolds nodded. "And he's wearing it in the photo on page 12. I flipped to page 12. It was a picture taken from a private Instagram account I didn't know existed, captioned, "Hustle Culture. The grind never stops." It showed David's wrist, adorned with the watch, resting on the steering wheel of the Range Rover I paid for. The date of the post was 2 days before he asked me for the tuition money. I felt a physical sickness in my gut, not of sadness, but of disgust. It was the feeling of finding a termite infestation in the foundation of a house you built with your own hands. "There's more," Reynolds said, tapping the folder. "Page 20, the medical bills." I turned the page. Elena had claimed, repeatedly over the last 4 years, that Sophie required specialized therapy for sensory processing issues and dietary sensitivities, costing roughly $600 a week. I had paid every invoice without question, believing I was helping my granddaughter. The report revealed that the clinic listed on the invoices was a shell company registered to Elena's sister in Arizona. The money went in, the money went out, and it was used to fund Elena's sister's lifestyle and kick back 40% to Elena. Sophie had never seen a specialist. Sophie was perfectly healthy. They were using their own daughter, my granddaughter, as a laundering mechanism for their greed. This was the breaking point. The loans were one thing. Using a child's phantom illness to extract cash from a grandfather was a level of depravity I hadn't calculated for. I closed the folder. "Thank you, Marcus," I said. "This is sufficient." "What are you going to do?" he asked, gathering his things. "I'm going to the reunion," I replied. The annual Whitmore family reunion was scheduled for the coming Saturday at the Lakeview Lodge, a sprawling estate owned by my cousin Robert. It was a mandatory attendance event, the one time of year the extended clan gathered to pretend we all liked each other. Usually, I dreaded it. This year, I was counting the minutes. In the days leading up to the Saturday, the social warfare intensified. Elena unleashed a barrage of digital propaganda. She posted a video of Sophie crying, likely staged or provoked, with the caption, "Missing Grandpa. Hard to explain to an 8-year-old why she's not good enough anymore." It garnered 400 likes and dozens of comments calling me a monster. My phone rang incessantly with calls from relatives. Aunt Clara, a woman who hadn't spoken to me since Christmas, called to pray for my hardened heart. My cousin Stephen sent a text suggesting I get a neurological evaluation because aggression is an early sign of Alzheimer's. They were building a narrative of Doc's senility. They were painting me as the erratic, confused old patriarch who had lost his grip on reality and turned on his benevolent, struggling children. It was a smart strategy. It capitalized on my age 72 and the natural tendency of people to side with the young and attractive parents. I didn't respond to a single text. I didn't defend myself. I let the silence amplify their confidence. I forwarded every screenshot, every voicemail, and every threat to Tom Harrison, who was compiling a defamation suit that would make their heads spin. But the lawsuit was for later. The reunion was for the soul. Saturday arrived with a steel gray sky that matched my mood. I dressed in my best suit, a navy three-piece that I usually wore for closing mergers. I packed the Reynolds report, the original promissory note, and the printed bank statements into my leather briefcase. I arrived at the lodge at 1 p.m. sharp. The parking lot was full. I saw David's Range Rover parked near the front. As I walked toward the main hall, I could hear the hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses. I opened the double doors and stepped in. The room went quiet. It wasn't a total silence, but a distinctive dampening of sound, like a heavy blanket being dropped. Eyes darted toward me, then away. Whispers exchanged behind hands. I saw David and Elena across the room near the buffet. They were holding court, surrounded by my sister Ruth and several cousins. David looked up, saw me, and his face tightened. He said something to Elena, who immediately adopted a look of tragic bravery. I walked to the bar and ordered a scotch, neat. I stood there, sipping it, letting the tension build. I was the ghost at the feast. After about 20 minutes, the ambush began. I saw them gathering. David, Elena, Ruth, and to my surprise, a man I recognized as Dr. Eris, a general practitioner who was a friend of the family but not my doctor. They moved toward me in a phalanx, their expressions somber. The room hushed completely. They were making a scene. Perfect. Dad, David said, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and performance. We need to talk. I turned slowly, swirling the amber liquid in my glass. We're at a party, David. Mingling is encouraged. Talking is optional. This isn't a joke, Arthur. Ruth chimed in, stepping forward and placing a hand on my arm. We're worried about you. We've all been talking. Your behavior this week, cutting off the family, the aggression, the paranoia. It's not you. We think, Elena added, her voice soft and weepy, that it might be time for you to get some help. Dr. Aris agrees that these sudden personality shifts can be symptomatic. I looked at Dr. Aris. Is that a diagnosis, doctor? Based on hearsay? I'd be careful. The medical board frowns on that. Aris looked uncomfortable. I'm just here as a friend, Arthur. But David is very concerned about your cognitive state. My cognitive state, I repeated, tasting the words. You think I'm losing my mind because I stopped paying for David's lifestyle. See? David said, gesturing to the crowd. He's obsessed with money. It's paranoia. Dad, we love you. We just want you to be safe. We think you should sign a temporary power of attorney just until you're stabilized. Coping with Mom's death has been hard, we know. The audacity was breathless. They were trying to stage a competency coup in front of 50 witnesses. They wanted control of the accounts. They wanted the flow to resume. I looked around the room. I saw pity in the eyes of my cousins. I saw judgment. They bought it. They actually believed I was the villain. I set my glass down on the bar with a sharp times clack, asterisk. You want to talk about reality, I said, my voice projecting clearly to the back of the room without shouting. Let's talk about reality. I lifted my briefcase onto the bar and clicked the latches open. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent room. David, you claim I am paranoid about money. You claim you are a struggling entrepreneur. You claim Sophie is sick. Don't bring Sophie into this. Elena shrieked, sensing the danger. She's my granddaughter, I said, cold as ice. I will bring her into this. I pulled out the first stack of papers, the medical records. This, I announced, holding up the invoice, is a bill for $600 a week for Sophie's therapy. I have paid this for 4 years, roughly $120,000. I let the paper drift to the floor. And this, I held up the investigator's report, is the corporate filing for the clinic, showing it is owned by Elena's sister, and the bank records showing the money being transferred from the clinic to Elena's personal account within 24 hours of my payment. A gasp rippled through the room. Elena's face went white. That's a lie, she screamed. He's forged it. He's crazy. Bank records don't hallucinate, Elena, I said, and neither do I. I pulled out the next item. Item 2, the consultancy. David, you told this family you were building a tech empire. You told me you needed bridge loans for payroll. I held up the photo of the Rolex. Nice watch, David. $12,000. Purchased with the payroll funds on October 14th. Is your wrist on the payroll? David was backing away now, shaking his head. Dad, stop, please. No, I said, relentless. You wanted an intervention. Here it is. I am intervening in your fraud. I reached into the briefcase and pulled out the thickest stack, the credit card statements showing the dinners, the trips, the gambling. You called me a burden, I said, looking directly at the crowd now. My granddaughter was taught to call me a burden because I am old, because I sit alone in a big house. But I am not the burden. I am the host. And you, I pointed at David and Elena, are the parasites. I turned to Dr. Eris, who looked ready to bolt for the door. Doctor, in your professional opinion, does a man capable of commissioning a forensic audit and tracing laundered funds through 3 shell companies sound like he is suffering from dementia? Or does he sound like a man who finally woke up? Eris didn't answer. He just stepped back. The room was deadly silent. The pity in the eyes of the guests had vanished, replaced by a horrified fascination. They were looking at David and Elena now, really looking at them. They saw the designer clothes, the expensive watch, the car outside, and they did the math. The narrative crumbled in seconds. David looked at me, his eyes wet, but not with sorrow, with the terror of exposure. Dad, he whispered, you're ruining us. I didn't ruin you, I said, closing the briefcase. I simply turned on the lights. The ruin was already there. I picked up my scotch, finished it in one swallow, and looked looked at my sister Ruth. She was pale, her hand over her mouth. Ruth, I said, if you're still worried about my mental state, you're welcome to read the full report. I made copies. I dropped a USB drive on the bar. Then I walked toward the door. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. No one said a word. I could hear Elena sobbing, real, ugly sobbing this time, and David trying to hush her. As I reached the door, David yelled out, a last, desperate attempt to regain control. You can't leave. We have rights. We have nothing. I stopped and turned back one last time. You have your youth, I said, and you have your philosophy degree. Figure it out. I walked out into the cool afternoon air. My heart was pounding, not from stress, but from the adrenaline of execution. It was done. The truth was out. The bridge wasn't just burned. I had nuked the canyon. But as I walked to my car, I saw Sophie sitting on a bench near the entrance. A nanny, a young girl I didn't recognize, looking at her phone next to her. Sophie looked up at me. Her eyes were red. She had heard the shouting. She looked small and confused. I paused. The anger evaporated, leaving only a dull ache. I wanted to go to her. I wanted to hug her and tell her it wasn't her fault. But I knew that any contact now would be used against me. Elena would claim I was trying to kidnap her or influence her. I had to be strategic. I had to play the long game. I gave Sophie a small, sad wave. She didn't wave back. She just watched me with those big, judging eyes. The eyes that had rolled at me 4 days ago. I got into my car and drove away. The discovery phase was over. The confrontation was complete. Now came the aftermath. And I knew, as I merged onto the highway, that this was where the real war would begin. David and Elena were cornered animals now. They had lost their reputation, their income, and their social standing in one afternoon. They would retaliate with everything they had. They would weaponize the legal system. They would weaponize Sophie. I needed to be ready for the scorched earth. I dialed Tom Harrison. It's done, I said. They tried the dementia angle. I countered with the fraud evidence. How did it play? Evidence, Tom asked. Total devastation, I said. Now, I want to file for emergency custody of Sophie, based on the medical fraud. If they were faking her illness to get money, that's child abuse, or at least exploitation. That's a high bar, Arthur, Tom warned. We'll need more than just financial records. We'll need a pediatric evaluation. Then get the court order, I said. I am not leaving that girl in that house while they sink. They'll take her down with them. I hung up. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the road. I felt a strange sense of peace, a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I was alone, yes, but I was no longer a victim. I was the architect of my own life again, and I had work to do. The legal machinery that I set in motion on the Monday following the reunion was not a bludgeon, but a scalpel, precise, cold, and utterly unforgiving. At 9 a.m. sharp, Tom Harrison filed 3 separate motions in the county court: a civil suit for the recovery of the $150,000 loan plus interest, a petition for emergency temporary guardianship of Sophie based on credible evidence of medical neglect and financial exploitation, and a defamation complaint against Elena, specifically regarding the social media campaign, alleging I was suffering from dementia. The speed of the counteroffensive stunned them. David, who had spent his adult life shielded by my wallet, had no war chest. He attempted to hire a reputable defense attorney, a man named Sterling, who charged $600 an hour, but Sterling dropped him within 2 days when the retainer check drawn on the DW Solutions account bounced. David was forced to settle for a public defender for the family court hearing and a strip mall lawyer for the civil suits. The foreclosure notice on 42 Oak Creek Drive was posted on their front door on November 3rd, just 17 days after I cut the funds. I didn't revel in it, but I watched it happen from a distance. Through the reports Marcus Reynolds continued to file, the aftermath was characterized by the rapid disintegration of the facade David and Elena had built. Without the glue of my money, their marriage dissolved with shocking speed. It took exactly 6 weeks. The moment the pressure applied, they turned on each other. Elena claimed in a deposition that she had no knowledge of the loan terms and that David had coerced her into the financial schemes. David, in a desperate attempt to salvage his own skin, provided text messages showing Elena orchestrating the fake medical bills for the Arizona clinic. It was a race to the bottom, and they were both winning. The custody hearing was the grim centerpiece of that winter. It took place in courtroom 4B before Judge Sylvia Vance, a woman known for her impatience with theatrics. I sat at the plaintiff's table, silent, while Tom laid out the evidence. He didn't scream. He simply projected the spreadsheet of the medical payments next to Sophie's actual pediatric records, which showed a perfectly healthy child who hadn't seen a doctor in 18 months. The guardian ad litem, a court-appointed advocate named Mrs. Gable, testified that when she interviewed Sophie, the child recited scripted lines about her sensory issues, but couldn't explain what they were, eventually breaking down and admitting that, "Mommy says I have to be sick, so Grandpa helps us." That admission was the death knell. I saw Elena's face crumble, not into sadness, but into a twisted mask of rage at being exposed by her own daughter. Judge Vance granted me temporary guardianship immediately, pending a full investigation. I walked out of that courtroom not with a trophy, but with a terrified 8-year-old girl holding my hand, clutching a small backpack that contained everything she owned that hadn't been sold or seized. We drove home in silence. When we got to my house, the big, empty house they had mocked Sophie stood in the foyer, looking at the floor. "Am I in trouble?" she whispered. "No, Sophie," I said, crouching down down, my knees cracking slightly. A sound of age I no longer felt the need to hide. You are safe, and you are not a job. You are just a child. The deprogramming of Sophie was the hardest work of my life. Harder than building my company. Harder than mourning my wife. For the first 3 months, she hoarded food in her room, hiding granola bars under her pillow because she had internalized a scarcity mindset from her parents' constant panic over money. She asked me repeatedly if I was going to send her back, if she cost too much. It broke my heart every single day. I set up a trust for her, but I didn't tell her about it. Instead, we operated on a transparent allowance system, $5 a week for chores. She had to learn the relationship between labor and value, a lesson her father had skipped. Meanwhile, the dismantling of David and Elena continued. David declared Chapter 7 bankruptcy on January 14th. The Range Rover was repossessed in a viral video recorded by a neighbor. I didn't watch it, but I heard about it. He moved into a one-bedroom apartment on the south side of the city and took a job as a sales associate at a car dealership, an irony that was not lost on me. He called me once, on Christmas Eve. "Dad," he said, his voice hollow. "I'm alone." "I know," I said, sitting by the fire where Sophie was reading a book. "It's quiet, isn't it? Can I come home?" he asked. "No," I replied. "You are home. That apartment is the home you earned. This house is the home I earned." I hung up. It was cold, yes, but forgiveness without restitution is just enabling, and he had nothing to offer but more need. Elena fared worse. The investigation into the fake clinic triggered a state probe into insurance fraud. She wasn't prosecuted criminally due to a plea deal where she turned evidence against her sister, but she was blacklisted from her social circles and left the state, moving to Florida to start over with a new mark. She never called Sophie. Not once. It was as if Sophie was a prop that had been retired. That silence hurt Sophie more than the screaming ever did, but it was a clean wound, one that could heal, rather than an infection that kept spreading. The years began to move faster then, slipping by in a rhythm of school runs, piano lessons, and quiet dinners. The resolution phase wasn't a single moment, but a slow accretion of peace. I retired from the board of my company completely, liquidating my shares to focus entirely on raising my granddaughter. We traveled not to luxury resorts, but to national parks, to museums, to places where history and nature made you feel small in a healthy way. I watched Sophie grow from a terrified, parroting mimic of her mother into a thoughtful, somewhat serious, but kind young woman. She had scars, certainly. She was wary of people who smiled too much. She was fiercely protective of her own money, but she was real. One afternoon, 5 years after the confrontation at the Gilded Olive, I was sitting on the back patio. Sophie, now 13, was doing homework at the iron table. The sun was setting, casting that golden hour light that makes everything look like a memory before it's even gone. "Grandpa?" she said, not looking up from her algebra. "Yeah, kiddo," I answered. "Dad emailed me today." I stiffened slightly. David had been kept at arm's length, allowed supervised visits that he rarely utilized, claiming he was too busy working to get back on his feet. "What did he want?" "He said he's getting married again, to a girl named Crystal. He wants me to come to the wedding." She tapped her pencil against the paper. "He said you're invited too, but he knows you won't come." I took a sip of my iced tea. "Do you want to go?" Sophie stopped tapping. She looked at me, her eyes clear and unclouded by the blue light of a screen. "No," she said. "He asked for money in the same email. He said weddings are expensive and he's a little short." She let out a short, dry laugh, a sound that was distinctively hers, not her mother's. "He hasn't changed, has he? People rarely do, unless the pain of staying the same outweighs the pain of changing," I said. "And your father has a very high tolerance for his own dysfunction." I told him no, Sophie said. "I told him I have a math test on Monday, and that I'm not an ATM." I smiled. It was the return on investment I had been waiting for. Not money, but character. "Good," I said. "Finish your homework. I'm making risotto tonight. The real kind, not the $45 kind. The kind that takes 40 minutes of stirring." She groaned, but she was smiling. "The kind that takes patience," I corrected. As I stood up to go to the kitchen, I checked my reflection in the sliding glass door. I looked older. My hair was entirely white now. I moved a little slower, but the heaviness was gone. The burden that Elena had spoken of, the weight of being the provider, the anchor, the bank, the fool, it had evaporated. I realized then that they were right about one thing. I was a burden to them. I was the burden of conscience. I was the burden of reality, and by removing myself, I hadn't punished them. I had simply let gravity take its course. They fell because they had nothing holding them up but me. I walked into the kitchen, the smell of garlic and shallots already in the air. I was 77 years old. I had lost a son, essentially. I had lost the illusion of a perfect family, but I had saved the future. I looked out the window at Sophie, who was now texting a friend, looking normal, looking light. I washed my hands and began to stir the rice. I was alone in my generation, the last of the old guard. But as the water boiled and the house filled with the warmth of a meal made with intent, I knew I wasn't lonely. I was vindicated. And more importantly, I was free. The invoice was paid in full. The account was closed. And for the first time in a decade, the ledger was balanced.